Welcome to Talking Impact, your go-to podcast for exploring the powerful connection between mental health, education, and resilient youth. Join us as we uncover insights and stories that inspire classrooms, stronger minds, brighter futures, and a lasting impact in our society. Well, Lauren, welcome. Another episode of Talking Impact, where we delve deep into the stories, experiences behind Impact Society's programs and our work to better the mental health and purpose of a generation of Canadian young people, to help them overcome, to deal with life's challenges, and to navigate life in a way that not only helps them to not fall into the negative aspects of mental health and addictions, but also to help them develop a sense of self-concept, a sense of community, and a sense of purpose. We know that when we do these things, there's significant increases in their resilience and mental health, but also they become people builders and the citizens that we need, the family members we need in order to deal with some of these big challenges we have in our world. So Lauren Remple, welcome to the show. Lauren is the co-creator of our Reconciliation Through Education program, which we've been working on for social studies courses for students in high school. And just wanted to today help everybody who's listening and watching get to know Lauren, but also get to know this important work that we're doing as an organization together to bring about programs that can be utilized in schools that not just teach students about the subject, but help them to build an experiential journey and strengthen their own self-concept in pursuit of more reconciliation in our nation, for individuals and for society. So welcome, Lauren.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Maybe just start out by introducing yourself and how did you get here? What's your life journey been? Take us through the course of Lauren's life that brought you to the point where you're developing programs, not just with Impact Society, but with companies to help them to play a better role in reconciliation.
Sure. Thanks. Well, I think the most logical place to start is just a little bit of an introduction of who I am. So, Lauren Remple, I'm a long-term guest here in Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, third generation guest. My family is, on my mom's side, originally from Alexander First Nation, which is just outside of Edmonton in Treaty 6 territory. And on my dad's side, we're mixed European descents, lots of Mennonite, Russian, kind of German, and then my grandma came over was born here shortly after her family came over from Sweden. So we have lots of northern blood here in that runs through my veins.
It's very Canadian tapestry.
Yeah. And I came to this space for, I've always been driven by having a career that is purposeful. I knew I never wanted to just like go to a corporation and start building more widgets or, trying to drive the bottom line. I always knew I was here on this earth to contribute and to have a purposeful part of my life. I started my work in this reconciliation, Indigenous relations, Indigenous matters kind of space at the University of Calgary. So I was there for 8 years, and I had the wonderful opportunity to learn under incredible people. Shauna Cunningham and Michael Hart are the kind of leaders in that space at the University of Calgary. And so I was so lucky to help implement their Indigenous strategy, Itapito, for 8 years before I moved on and thought I wanted to try something else. Now I have two companies, one that supports Impact Society in this project, and one that supports organizations and corporations with their reconciliation efforts. During my time at the University of Calgary, I stayed there for so long because I truly believe in the value of education, whether it's post-secondary, whether it's ongoing adult learning, whether it's just curious watching YouTube videos on how to do stuff. I just think that we can never stop learning. And so I've always really believed in the power of education and of learning. And so that's what drove me to want to do this work with Impact Society, was really to create something for youth, both Indigenous and non, to feel connected to something that's kind of bigger than themselves and contribute to making this country more equitable for Indigenous people.
Amazing. And I can't wait to dive into more of the work that you've been doing. Before we get into that, though, you talked a lot about that purpose in life, that has been a value, a taproot for you for your life, and it's led you down so many amazing pathways in your career. If you can think back to when you were younger, maybe junior high school, were there any key moments or people who instilled that value in you?
Yes. So I don't tell this story to people very often, but when I was in, and now I guess I'm telling the world.
Hopefully.
When I was in university, I started out at the University of Lethbridge, and I had a super fun time, probably a little too much fun. And they asked me to step away for a year to reevaluate whether or not I wanted to do post-secondary. So I took that time to truly reevaluate, and I saved up a bunch of money. I called my best friend and I said, let's go backpacking in Southeast Asia. So this was 2006, and this was 2007, and we went. We got jobs. We saved up a bunch of money. We quit them, and we flew to Bangkok in the middle of a coup, and we had the time of our lives. We spent a lot of time on the some of the islands that were affected by the Boxing Day tsunami in 2006, and seeing some of the resilience, some of the poverty, some of the ways that people in Thailand, specifically, a little bit in Indonesia as well, were rebuilding their lives after such a catastrophic natural disaster, is when I knew that I wanted to have a career that was purposeful, that was contributing to making somebody's life better. So I remember the day I decided to do that. It was the day before my 23rd birthday. I was sitting on an island called Koh Phi Phi. I was journaling, and I was getting ready to go into town for dinner for my birthday. And I thought, like, this is it. Like, this is the life I want to take. It has to be purposeful. It has to contribute to the greater good. It can't just be driving straight stakeholder value, which I mean is fine.
Yes.
Sure. Important.
Yes.
Part of our economic cycle.
If you want to change the world, you're going to need some money.
Exactly. Yeah. However, I know for me, it's ultimately comes down to connections, purpose, and trying to contribute to making something better for
I love people. That. For people listening, and I've had a similar experience, similar age, right? Where I was kind of sick and tired of doing what I had been doing, and knew that I needed to do something bigger than myself, to invest in others. And I had opportunities to be able to mentor youth and to work internationally very early in my career that really set me on the course I'm on today. At that time, though, did you have any like aha moments or a clear vision of taking that sense of purpose that you were striving for and applying it to work with Indigenous and non-Indigenous here in Canada?
Yeah. So I think back to that story.
Or when did that occur?
Yes.
Like, when did the dots connect to the why to the what?
Yeah. So I knew. I thought that in 2006, reconciliation wasn't even like or 2007, like that time wasn't even really a conversation that people in this country were having. You know, later in 2007, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was voted in as or ratified by the UN General Council. Canada voted against it. So this conversation wasn't happening in Canada in 2007. And so I thought, okay, I want to do something. I'm going to work in international development. So I tried super hard to get into this space. I'm trying to intern places. I'm emailing people. I'm taking courses. I'm doing all this work, and it just never transpired into anything. So I'm working at the University of Calgary. Conversation. It's 2015, 2016. The TRC is happening. That's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is, traveling across the country. It's been released, the 94 calls to action. People are starting to have conversations around how this works, or what this might look like, or whatever. organizations are early adopters or are creating strategies. And I was like, okay, like this, I want to get involved in this. But I remember I was volunteering for a trip with the University of Calgary to Yukon, the Yukon territory. So they had a couple of service leadership trips that students could go on, and they needed staff to kind of chaperone. So I volunteered to do this Yukon trip, which was, so it was a year-long kind of prep of teaching students more about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and maybe some of the things that they might expect when going up to the Yukon, because it was Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. So we went up there for 10 days. We stayed at the Kluane Lake Research Station. We did, we volunteered with a number of different First Nations across the Yukon. And we spent a lot of time with some really incredible people. And that's when it clicked, when I started to realize, like, I don't need to do this internationally. Like, I could just do this here with Indigenous people and take all the gifts that I've been given to be able to access education, and to all of these gifts that I have, I can just start doing that here. I don't need to go abroad to do it. It's right here.
Tell me about how the Truth TRC came about. It's one of those things that we hear now. The conversations are happening. Oftentimes we lose the context, though. And when something goes from policy to implementation, sometimes it becomes another checklist. We see the same thing in curriculum outcomes, right? Oh, we just need to check these boxes and we'll have A students, right? But so often that's not what happens, right? They become more of a checklist versus an actual pursuit with a purpose. Maybe back up a little bit and explain how the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada came about it, and what was the thing that started that. I'm pretty sure in South Africa they had a TRC that was very successful in their unity process.
So it really was around, and I don't know that there was one catalytic or cataclysmic event that was like, we're doing this. It was a series of advocacy movements, of grassroots movements. It was kind of the failed Royal Commission on Aboriginal People report that came out in the mid-90s that kind of landed and didn't go anywhere. So what I think was different with the TRC is that it traveled across the country and people shared their stories. Like there was storytelling, like residential school survivors. My grandmother was one of them. Shared their stories of what happened to them. So it was that opportunity to share, connect, and then there were things that people needed to do, things that governments needed to do, tangible things that need to happen for reconciliation to occur. So that you see that through the 94 calls to action. A lot of those things are really hard to do. Some of them are kind of like easy. Like some of them are, let's make a national holiday for Truth and Reconciliation. Okay, we did that. Some of them are completely redesigning the ways in which curriculum are taught or the ways in which legal systems are set up. So those are going to take a lot more work to fit through. So I'm glad that there is momentum on answering those calls. And I don't want that conversation to stop. And that's what I've dedicated my career to doing, is helping organizations answer those calls.
So how did those calls help to really zero in your focus in your career and your work early on? With UFC specifically, was there a process there of really deciding where to focus the strategy and the effort, and what was the purpose as well as the outcome you were striving for?
So I have an HR background. I didn't do HR in school. I was still on my international development kick at that time and during my undergrad, so I did international business, and but I landed in HR, and which lots of people do, and I landed in recruitment. So I've been working in HR recruitment for the last 15 years. When I graduated with my bachelor's, and so I've been focused really on that recruitment, retention, kind of learning and development piece, and that's a huge part of not the TRC specifically. It doesn't say like recruit X amount of people, and but it's more aligned. There's it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but it is a component like recruitment, retention, fair employment, good employment, access to good jobs, access to education that's going to help people get those good jobs. That's all part of the Truth and Reconciliation. It's all part of calls to action. It's all part of economic reconciliation. So I've been really focused in that piece. And how that's transpired for me is really supporting post-secondary students with their career journeys. And then now in that kind of corporate space, it's really around leadership. I focus a lot on leadership development and helping organizations ensure that their employee base kind of accurately reflects the population or the labor market is what we call it in kind of HR speak, the labor market at all levels of their organization. So what we tend to see is a lot of Indigenous people at those kind of entry level positions, and they're not moving up to director level or decision-making roles. So that's what I want to focus on as well, is helping organizations and people get up into those director level roles, those VP positions, those board positions, because that's where a lot of the power and decision making lies.
A little bit. Education is such a common theme, and it's not just school, right? Like a lot of the work you're doing is helping to educate and build education programs within companies. Maybe speak to that process and how you help them to escape that tendency to go into the corporate speak and the check boxes and know we need all of those things for accountability purposes, but to keep that purpose at the heart of it, to really make it intentional and authentic.
Yeah, and what I try to do with the work that I do is really I always try to keep in mind this notion of, you have the truth. Say you have the calls to action. You've identified call to action 92 is typically the ones that corporations are going to be working on, which is really around kind of recruitment and retention. It's really around capacity building, so teaching people or your employees kind of Indigenous cultural awareness or different ways that they can kind of contribute to reconciliation in their own world. So I kind of think of that as the so what. Okay, so you've got me in, I'm invested, I want to answer call to action 92, like now what do I do about it? So I always think about the so what and the now what. So I really try to, because I think a lot of corporations are bought into the so what. They're through lots of different reasons, they know that this is what they need to be doing. So I try to help them with the now what. And the point of what I'm trying to do is not to just get a bunch of Indigenous people into organizations and have them work in a Western way. That's not the point. The point is to embrace other ways of doing, Indigenous ways of doing, knowing, being, working, connecting. That's the point I'm trying to help organizations understand, is that you can't just check box like, yes, I have 5% Indigenous employees, but like none of them are happy. They're leaving. They don't feel safe. They feel tokenized. All of these different things. Like that's what I'm trying to work with organizations on.
Tokenization came to mind. How do you help educate organizations and teams to resist that? I
mean, that one's a tough one, because like you think you're like, okay, we've hired an Indigenous person. Now we're gonna like lean on them for all things related to being Indigenous. And like, that's the thing that you can't do, is you can't just expect them to kind of know everything, because they're going to be only able to speak from their own points of view. Right. And then, so I'm Cree. That's kind of whether that's what Alexander is a kind of we're Cree. But like lots of times I'll get asked in some context, like, what do the Métis people think about this? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm not Métis. Like, I don't know. Like, I could go ask some of my Métis friends. But I think what it ultimately comes down to is the onus on education is on the person and not the Indigenous person. Yeah. So I'm always happy to help colleagues or organizations with their like, this is how you kind of avoid it, is kind of educate yourself, maybe take do your research first, figure out how you want to do something first, and then bring it to an Indigenous colleague to kind of, I almost think verify or to work or to co-collaborate with, as opposed to just you're the Indigenous person, you do this. And because it's exhausting, this is hard work, it's emotional, it takes a lot out of you. And so to always expect your Indigenous employees to take on the equity tax, that's just not, doesn't work. No. Because it's hard. I don't want to be in this space all the time. Yeah. Sometimes I just want to, I don't know, do my accounting work. I don't always have to do everyone else's emotional labor. Yeah,
exactly. So. Emotional labor, that's a good way to put it. And to not assume that we're doing good and we're moving towards reconciliation just by having that token, whether it's a entry-level employee, we hit our quota, or it's, we have this person who can answer and defend anything related to our Indigenous work. That's not authentic, nor is it honoring. I get this question a lot, and I've started to frame this concept around reconciliation that it's not a destination, it's a habit. And there's a lot in those 97 calls to action, and we've defined 2 of those as an organization in our work directly related to education. But how would you define reconciliation, and what are the symptoms of it happening in the right way?
That's a good one. I think that, so Jody Wilson-Raybould is a very prominent Indigenous leader in this country. She wrote a couple of really great books. One of them is called kind of True Reconciliation. That's the topic. But in that book, she talks about this idea that reconciliation is this marathon, right? And it's long. It's going to take a long time. It's the dismantling of systems. It's unlearning of colonial thinking. It's each and every person that's listening to this podcast, that's in this room, that's doing anything, has a significant amount of unlearning, myself included, to do to kind of unlearn that colonial thinking or that patriarchal thinking or the different ways of thinking that we've been taught in through our education system or through media or through our parents or through culture or the people that we hang out with, right? So if we think about this reconciliation being this long journey, and you're kind of plodding along, you have to go the whole way. You can't just run the same 500 meters over and over and expect there to be any kind of substantial change. So that's what I mean when it kind of going back to, I love that we have this National Day for Truth and Reconciliation statutory holiday. I've seen a lot of people attending events, learning, really using that day in the way in which it was intended. But that can't just be it. It always has to be moving forward on the stuff that's harder, because we need to get to, kilometer 20. We can't just keep treading or kind of running at kilometer 2. Yeah.
Because in a way that becomes its own form of tokenism.
Yeah, exactly.
We hit the quota.
Yeah,
we honored the day. We did the team meeting, the workshop, the event, and we see that so often in the education world as well when it comes to mental health, that oftentimes it's, well, what are you doing to support the mental health of the students in your school? And they'll talk about the assembly that they had, or the awareness campaign that was launched, or even sometimes this workshop that they had to teach aptitude around awareness of mental health. That said, talking about it doesn't make it so. And so our whole method and our whole approach to learning is to create these rich experiences that help individuals to form a stronger identity because of the experiences and the knowledge that they're receiving. It's not so much the unlearning, however, that's often necessary, especially for those of us in our post-secondary years. When we met over 2 years ago, what were your initial thoughts around the concept of building out a new program for social studies that addressed not just the TRC calls to action regarding Indigenous stories and Indigenous ways of knowing within education, but also to really come into that head and that heart piece of social emotional learning, if you will.
I think that is exactly it. Like, I think that historically, so I think about people, okay, so I'm going to just rewind a little. I think about people our age who weren't taught about residential schools.
Mm-hmm.
People older than us, people, a little younger. Now, like, my kids are going into grade 6 and grade 10, and they've been taught about residential schools and colonization and all kinds of different things for years.
Mm-hmm.
So it's different for them. But I think that it always, and I think this is indicative of a lot of our education system, and this, it's just the way it is this very like head learning. It's like, memorize some facts, write it on a test, congratulations, here's your high school diploma. And what I think is missing is the heart learning, which is what we're trying to do with this program, is that, it's great. We do, there is some head learning involved. We do need to know about some of the different things that happened that led to colonization, the way that relationships happen. But what we're really trying to get at, and what I think that this program makes unique, and in the way that we've created it too is unique, is that it is trying to get heart learning, because that's what we need. We need people to turn on their hearts more often and lead from their hearts, and lead from empathy, and lead from connection, and lead from all kinds of different things than where they might lead if it was just their head.
Tell me about how we're doing that with a social study. Oftentimes, I love social studies.
Yeah, me too.
You too, and that's why we're so excited about this. But there's those kids who just see a bunch of facts about stuff that happened a long time ago that doesn't relate to them. How are we flipping that script within this new program, especially within social studies in grade 11, which is all about nationalism? How does this? It seems like a square peg in a round hole.
It does.
How are we doing this?
Okay, so I also have always loved social studies. I think it's a really interesting topic, but it is very like head focused. So the way that we're going to try, and disclaimer, we're just going to pilot, so we need some feedback from our students first. But this is our first go at it. But what we're trying to do is taking the HEROES method, which we know it's kind of around that social emotional learning. It's around internal reflection. It's around experiential
feelings,
learning,
thoughts, behaviors, convictions.
Exactly. So what we're trying to do is then take that kind of model, put it into a social studies curriculum, and then have students have a better understanding of what it might have been felt like to have your nation be taken over by another one, or how important cultural resurgence is. So we take students on a little bit of a journey through 9 modules, and we take them on this journey through the 7 sacred teachings, which is an Indigenous kind of methodology, framework, way of thinking, way of being, that embodies different character attributes.
And values.
Values. So wisdom.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah. So wisdom, for example. So we start with wisdom. And wisdom is all about understanding the notion of wisdom versus knowledge, which I think is actually head and the heart. So we start with wisdom, and wisdom is all about what Indigenous ways of doing nationhood identity looked like pre-contact. So we want to ensure that students leave this module with a better understanding of traditional Indigenous governance, languages, trade routes, roles in the community, the different ways that Indigenous nations lived pre-contact. And we tied that to wisdom as the 7 sacred teaching because, in my opinion, and I think this is opinion shared by many Indigenous people, is that historically we look at Indigenous people as being very primitive, being very not technical, and you hear about this noble savage kind of myth where and it's romanticized in Western movies, in literature of the time, of contact, of Indigenous people just being very primitive, pagan, all kinds of different words to describe them, when in actuality, they had incredibly complex knowledge systems, trade routes, governance that took care of individuals, the collective, and the land, and the different animal nations, plant nations, rivers, and they're stewards of the land in an incredibly complex ecosystem that they were part of, not masters of. So we really want to make sure that when students leave this first module, they have an understanding of wisdom. I feel like with that one personally, I'm trying to do a little bit of myth busting.
Yes. So. And it's so important to know where we're going. We have to know where we've been, and for so long, where we've been as this Canadian collection of nations misses that, and misses the beauty and the gift from those nations as well, and it does a disservice. And when we do that in our own lives, even when we forget where we've come from, it's very hard to know where we're going. So it makes sense to me, at least, as to why that's tied to the wisdom from the seven sacred teachings. Maybe go a little bit more in terms of the process that we've now gone through over the last couple of years as we've been collectively designing this experience and this education program.
Yeah. So
the team that we've put together,
sure,
and the way of being that we've adopted.
Yeah. So we've really taken it slow. Like, I think about, it was March 2022, February 2022, when Jordan was at my house, and I was just sharing that I wanted to kind of branch out and do some of my own work. And he said, well, like, my organization's looking to do that. Let's chat. And so we started. It was really a long process of ideation of what this could look like. And then from there, Impact Society being a non-Indigenous organization, but with a lot of kind of historical ties or relationships with Indigenous communities, but all of the employees being non-Indigenous, really wanted to make sure that we spent some time understanding kind of how this was going to play out, that it was really about co-creation with, not creation on behalf of. Yes. So we spent a lot of time learning about different Indigenous frameworks, learning about the importance of relationships, of reciprocity, of ensuring that although we may be gifted this knowledge through our relationships with elders or whatever the case may be, it's that Indigenous knowledge is still owned by Indigenous people, regardless of kind of who's using it. So we really had to unpack that. So we spent a lot of time doing that. We spent a lot of time doing some Indigenous curriculum development workshops, so that everyone that was on the Impact team had a really good understanding of the why and kind of where we were coming from, so that we could feel a little bit more comfortable doing creating the project. So how we actually ended up doing is through relationships, people we knew, people who had been involved in Impact Society for a number of years, we gathered them into a circle of advisors. They're mostly Indigenous educators, leaders within their communities, to help develop the curriculum. And that first summer that we had our circle of advisors was just last summer. It was 2020, what year? 2023. And we spent that whole summer just building relationships with them, because we wanted to make sure that the foundation of relationality was there. Because we can't just, the whole point of, we couldn't just create a curriculum that was all about reconciliation or doing things in an Indigenous way and not do it in an Indigenous way. So we really spent that time. And so we built these relationships with our circle of advisors. We've done some really great work that was really just about visiting, building relationships, seeing how people are doing, so that in the fall of last year is when we really got started on the actual curriculum development itself. Now, what we've also done on top of our circle of advisors, and actually next week we're really excited to be able to kind of merge these two circles, is that we also have an elders advisory circle. So our elders advisory circle consists of elders from different treaties and nations across Alberta, and they're helping us with some of those stories related to the seven sacred teachings, or they're helping us validate the curriculum, and they're helping us ensure that the depth and breadth of what we're trying to accomplish is really there. So next week, I'm so excited to bring everyone together in person and have these concentric circles kind of become one circle.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
There's a phrase that I believe is absolutely necessary in this work. It's nothing for us without us. And it's not just the platitude, it's the essence of what we've been experiencing together and the relations that we've been building. That idea of relatability isn't just the way of doing and the way of being that helps us to align our work with the Indigenous nations that we're telling stories with and building education journeys with, but it also goes into the heart of the program as well as the curriculum and social studies around nationalism, and that because of this tapestry we have in this country, there's nations of nations, and how do we understand that from a relational perspective in order to bring out the best from everyone? Maybe go into a little bit around, like, I think something that's always a consideration for us is that this program is for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. For those Indigenous students, though, how do you see this program helping them, not just on their reconciliation journey, but even in their own self-concept and understanding where they're from and where they're going?
Yeah. I think for me, and what is the most important is that, and it's been a number of decades since I was in high school, but I do remember thinking, Indigenous people are often too in this country kind of framed in this kind of deficit mindset thinking. So it's very much, a lot of highlights on the effects of intergenerational trauma, but very little discussion on who caused that intergenerational trauma, right? So what I hope, or what I'm hoping will be one of the outcomes for Indigenous students in here, is that they see themselves in the curriculum, and they see themselves in a curriculum from a strengths-based mindset or lens. So we're not here to talk about the deficits. We're here to say, this is what Indigenous nationhood looked like pre-contact. This is the relationship of what it looked like between Europeans and Indigenous people kind of in that time period before the Indian Act and some of those assimilation acts came into play. And then we talk about the colonization and assimilation in the Indian Act. And then we talk about the resilience and cultural resurgence that has been going on for decades. The rights advocacy and ensuring that Indigenous students know that, there are people that have been working towards ensuring that they have a good life for decades too. Yeah. And I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of those folks who were working on an advocacy and rights and resurgence during the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And then in 10 or 20 years, I want them to stand on mine.
So yes, that's what it's about. Yeah. Bringing that next generation to be better for themselves and for their future generations.
Exactly.
That 7 generations concept is something that really embodies the work that we do at Impact Society and this project especially. We're talking about the process too, because oftentimes what's the difference, right? And there's lots of about programs in terms of reconciliation in the history. There's a lot of typical social studies programs that are stories that you got to read, historical things you got to write an essay about, or you got to present and you got to write a test, your typical method. How have we developed a method building, and not just building, but really taking the Impact Society's method of social emotional development and Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and what does that process look like for a student in any given week in the program?
the difference in this one is, and there are going to be some assessments where students have to kind of get a better understanding of, a certain piece of literature or legislation, or something where they're going to have to read or write. But what we're more focused on is Indigenous ways of assessment. So in Indigenous cultures, are traditionally very oral, right? Like there wasn't really a written word. It was more storytelling. It was pictographs. It was all kind of in that oral way. So I'm more interested in having students be assessed in that way. So can you tell a story of your own journey? Can you tell a story of who you are, where you're from? Because that's part of an Indigenous way of knowing is who you are. So we really want to be ensure as well that there are elements of Indigenous ways of thinking into the program as well. So I think about and we're still workshopping or developing where things fit, but we want to look at what is an Indigenous way of I'm trying to think back to the I think it's the wisdom module where we're talking about potentially incorporating Indigenous seasonal kind of stories. So having the seasons dictate the ways in which we live our lives as opposed to the Roman Catholic calendar. Yeah. So, like and I kind of feel this too. And I don't know if maybe you do, but for me, January seems like a very unusual time to start a year. Like it's still dark. It's like, it doesn't feel very like renewal-y. But spring, that feels like, I'm like, oh, like we're kind of coming out of winter hibernation. The flowers are here. Like I'm happy. This seems like a time when I might want to restart some of my goals, or it feels like a new year. So it's more thinking about what some of those different perspectives might look like.
I love it. It's not just the same old pattern for the same old pattern's sake. It's opening up the context to understand that there's more to the cycles and to the person that we're becoming and that we are than just the grid, if you will.
Yeah.
When I think about the importance of experiential learning is a big part of every program that we create, and how much we've been intentional about infusing not just the 7 sacred teachings, but also incorporating land-based teachings and different iterations of that, along with other experiential lessons for every chapter, to not just help equip them to be able to do the presentation and to be able to speak to what they've learned and get the grade, but really to help do that heart and head learning simultaneously. Maybe speak to the importance of that from Indigenous learning perspective, from and how that mirrors what Impact Society is doing and what students might be able to expect when it comes to engaging in this program in an experiential way.
And I think that's just it. Is experiential learning. You're physically doing it, right? Like, so my husband and I were building a fence right now in our backyard, and in order to prepare, neither of us have ever built a fence before. So in order to prepare, we're watching YouTube videos. We're like writing down what we're going to do. We have a plan. And that's kind of what our education system is. It's like, this is how it would do it. But like, I don't know if I can actually do it until I do it. Right. Yeah. So now our fence is almost built. We have, 8 panels left to pick it. I'm like, I can build a fence. Like I know I can do it because I did it. So that's kind of it. I think that experiential learning, it increases the breadth and depth of how you actually know, or your relationship with the content. It's not just writing out a paper. Yeah. It's actually
not just input, output.
Yeah. It's input, embody, understand, output. Like there's a bunch of steps there that when you don't take an experiential learning piece that kind of get missed. So that's a big focus for us too.
And we know in learning, we absorb 5 to 10% of what we read. Yeah. If it's audio visual, maybe we're at 40-50%. But when we actually do it,
so many different parts of your brain
have to teach it, we retain 80 to 90% of the content. And I'm really excited about this framework that we're building up. For instance, one of the assignments is to not just read the treaties of 7, treaty 6, 7, and 8, but to have the different groups go in and be able to work together to then teach the class about that treaty, what the ideals of said treaty were, and
Yes.
where it fell short and how it affects us today. I think that's such an important thing for all stages of knowing and stages of learning, is to not just hear about it, not just to input, output, regurgitate what we heard, but to actually have those experiences where we now have to give an account from our own perspective and to infuse our own stories into the greater story that's being told through the program. I think one of the most exciting but also the challenging pieces of this program too is the discussion around nationalism, which in grade 11 social, that's really the main topic.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of deconstruction, but not in a way that does away with any of the nationhood that they've probably learned in other social studies courses and what's being taught in your mainstream social studies curriculum. But something really cool that I'd like to hear your perspective on is how we're opening up the context to understand that as a nation, and in your introduction, Alexander Cree, lots of Nordic, some German, some Russian, and there's these different nations represented in most of us, especially in Canada, that I think is an easy way for us to then parallel into, okay, on a macro scale, what does that look like? We really are a nation of nations, and for the most part, a lot of these nations arrived in the last couple hundred years, whereas there's been nations sharing this land, sharing this space for tens of thousands of years prior. Maybe share with us this concept of nationalism, how beautiful it can be when we open it up to help people understand the variety and the necessity for that diversity within our collective society.
Yeah, and I think when I think about, referring to this like nation of nations, like I think the power of language is really important. And I just finished up teaching at the University of Calgary for their Truth and Reconciliation certificate with their continuing education faculty. And one thing I always talked about with my students was using like the power of language. So instead of referring to like an Indigenous community, it is a nation. So I'm going to, like, I live near Sutina. So when I'm going to a different nation, and I don't need a passport to go there, but it is. So when I think about that notion of kind of respect of what nations are, I think it's really important to use that language, because they're oftentimes Indigenous, or the nations will be referred to just as communities or the reserve or kind of whatever. But if we start thinking about changing that language to nation, you start to get a better understanding of the sovereignty and self-determination and the rights that Indigenous people have here in Canada, in what is now known as Canada. And I think exerting some of that sovereignty is what nations are trying to do. A lot of them are struggling because of the confines of the Indian Act. And what we're trying to do is have more economic self-determination, have inherent rights. Like the Indigenous people have inherent rights. Everybody has inherent rights. But Indigenous people have very specific rights in this country, as outlined by the Section 35 of the Constitution. And I think that when we start to think about Indigenous people as sovereign people, that's when we start to be able to have those conversations about nation to nation building, because it's not just Canada telling Indigenous people what to do. We don't want that anymore. We never wanted that, to be clear. But we're trying not to stand for it anymore. So you can see lots of different economic reconciliation projects through kind of holding equity in resource development, or even we talk about this in the program, but it's the response to the white paper. So the white paper came out in the 60s through John Chrétien, through the first Trudeau prime minister, and it was really and it was another assimilation tactic where it was try to continue absorbing Indigenous people into the general body politic, the general population. And they responded with the red paper, which was really about Indigenous control over Indigenous education. And it was we want control over what our students are taught, what our children are taught, how they're taught, all these things. So you start to see some of those education pieces coming up.
You mentioned something that I think is a powerful term talking about the power of words here. It's that nation-to-nation building. Can you explain a little bit more of that, just so that I can fully understand how it relates to this work that we're doing in the program, but also the work of reconciliation? Because I really do see nation-to-nation building, first getting the concept, but then living it out as one of the keys to going the full 20 miles.
Yeah, so in my opinion, it's really about understanding that Indigenous nations, so the Alexander First Nation, Tsuut'ina Nation, all the different 630 nations, the Métis Nation, Inuit, they're all, prior to colonization, we're all their own nations, and we just want that back. So it's recognizing that we are sovereign people living in what is now known as Canada, and Canada's trying to build their nation or continue it. We're trying to build ours and get back some more of what was taken from us, and doing that through the TRC, through UNDRIP, through UNDRIPA, so the Act, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act, that came into royal assent about 3 years ago. So we're trying to assert some of that sovereignty again and be seen and taken seriously as our own nations, as opposed to these kind of wards of the government that is the way the Indian Act is kind of still governs. So it's more about self-governance, self-determination, economic reconciliation. We want to dictate how we live, not have that be imposed upon us by the Canadian government.
That it's still called the Indian Act is a great shame.
Yes.
And speaks to the tokenism often that we're trying to overcome. When it comes to this program and that concept that you just shared so well, how is this program helping to facilitate that nation-to-nation building with the students that we're going to be delivering it to?
I think grade 11 is such an impressionable time too, and I think it's a really good time to for students to get a good understanding of kind of
worldview.
Worldview. You're starting to figure out a little bit about who you want to be and who you are and where your values might lie. And obviously that's a lifelong process. The person that I was when I was 15 in grade 11 social studies is not the person that I am currently, but it's not super far off. It's the foundation was kind of set there. So I think that grade 11 is a really great time for students to start figuring out who they are and what that means, and get a good understanding of what nationhood is, because I think too about Canada and the country that it is that there isn't really one definition of who is Canadian. We have a bustling immigration population. We have Indigenous people, we have First Nation, we have people who have been here since colonization. So there's lots of people whose families have been here for generations. So we have lots of people, and there isn't, in my opinion anyways, and people will probably disagree with me, but I don't think there's one definition of what is Canadian or who is Canadian or whatever the case may be. And I think that this program does a really good idea of also encouraging students to understand who they are and where they come from
within this context.
Yeah, within the context of Canada, because I think that sometimes people who might be a first or second generation immigrants to this country kind of lose themselves in some way to try and assimilate, because it's easier to assimilate culturally.
You kind of touched on my final question here, but I'm going to ask it in two ways. The first is the vision for that student, that ideal student for this program. They're going to this program. What's the vision for how this program helps them to form that concept of self within culture and for the future?
That's a tough one. I think that it's really developing a good sense of identity and who they are, and getting kind of different perspectives, because I think that we do a really good job of showing one perspective, but not a really good job of even showing multiple or different perspectives, and then letting folks understand which one makes sense for them. So I think it's providing students with some options about different ways that the story unfolded, the different ways that this country was unfolded, and it's the truth of what unfolded. It's not glossed over. It's, we spend extra class. Like we built out so that each module takes 2 classes, but the modules around colonization and the kind of, immediate effects of it, we had to take extra time for students to get through that so that they could process it. And so that they could understand that it wasn't rushed, and that module might take a little bit longer to teach. So I think that it's really just providing students with the opportunity to look at a problem from multiple lenses, which I think is just part of critical thinking.
Absolutely.
And should be part of how adults think is, okay, I'm going to think about this from different perspectives so that I can get a more holistic idea of what is going on in my reality.
The lost art of critical thinking, I think, is a huge piece to that vision, is to equip them with that awareness as well as that ability to do critical thinking, so that as they grow and they mature and they find their purpose and passion in their adult life, that they have that understanding of perspective for themselves and for the world around them. When you think of the program itself, though, now, think about, can you tell us what you see in terms of the vision for education through reconciliation, and the importance that it will hold, and the scope that it will move into in the years to come?
Well, what I would love to see, this is an incremental change, so it's going to take some time. But what I would love to see even 10 years from now, 5 years from now. So 5 years from now, students taking the program will be maybe graduating from university, graduating from trade school. They might be embarking on their first kind of career, or embarking on some adult decisions. And I would love to have seen them have some good critical thinking skills, have a good understanding of the history and legacy of colonization of this country. But also, I want to see Indigenous students see themselves in the curriculum, because we also need those Indigenous students kind of out learning the negotiation, governance, leadership skills to come back and lead their nations in a good way. So I think that's what I would love to see.
I love that. They're better equipped to carry the torch.
Yeah.
It's so necessary, and in this time in our society with the opioid crisis and the uncertainty and fear from COVID all the way through to what's happening now in our world. I can't think of something more important to be putting our time and our efforts behind to help that next generation do it better. And I can't help but think of the work that we're doing here in our nation, Canada, with a nation of nations. And this program, especially helping to understand, embrace, and to further that concept, that ideal, is something so needed around the world. That we can share this land. We can be many nations in one place if we can figure it out, and how to develop that sense of shared relationality, like you said, in a way that helps to continue to equip and foster that collaboration for years to come.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any last thoughts in terms of the conversation that we've had that you wanted to share?
I just really want to just express, I think, my own gratitude for getting to work on this project for so long with you. It's so fun. It's the highlight of my week, truly. So much so that, I think about it constantly, and it's challenged me in ways that I wasn't expecting. But I think that's kind of the point too, is to, I grew up here in Calgary in a relatively middle-class neighborhood. I went to a relatively I went to public high school. So it's enabled me to continue on my own journey of unlearning and connecting with myself and who I am and who I want to be. So I think just gratitude for you, Chris, for Impact Society, for the folks, our circle of advisors and our elders advisory circle and our funders and everybody who is going to touch this program and wants to be part of something that's larger than themselves, because that's ultimately what I want to do with my life anyways. So
I have one more thing to say. We were at Siksika Nation on Tuesday working with a career development course using our Indigenous parallel of heroes, which is called Warriors, and the chapter we did was on gratitude. And when you said gratitude for the person I am and the person I'm becoming, that's really why we do what we do.
Yeah.
So thank you for doing what you do.
Thank you for having me.
And helping take that that challenge and that opportunity to know who we are, know where we're going, and be grateful for it to that next generation. It's
Absolutely.
beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And this has definitely been a highlight for me. So thank you.